Claude Smadja, thanks very much for joining us.
A pleasure.
You talked in your presentation about globalization too, and how that is a fragmented as opposed to unified globalization. But is it even globalization if it's fragmented?
Yes, I think the two notions are not contradictory, because on the one hand, you have this interaction, this collapse of the barriers in terms of financial transaction, telecommunication, communication between people, trade, everything that you can imagine. But on the other hand, it means that all this flux of ideas, exchanges, interaction are not leading to, in a way, people thinking, living, acting along one same model. And so what we expected at the end of the 90s, what we will have this great convergence, you know, that...
well, Americanization, in fact, that's what everyone thought it was.
Exactly. And in fact, what we realize today is that, of course, more and more people are taking the same standards of corporate governance, for instance. More and more you have the same, say, accounting standards. But at the same time, people keep their identities, they keep their values, which are not the same all over the world, despite what we would like to think in the Western world. And more people, in a way, want to assert their own identity. So instead of having, say, one model of governance or one model of political modus operandi, say, the US model or the Western model.
You called it, in fact, the Washington Consensus, I think.
The Washington Consensus was this notion that everything will converge in a kind of compact between democracy as we know it or practice it in the West and free markets. And this Washington Consensus, in fact, exploded in the mid of the first decade of the 21st century, when we realized that, for instance, the Chinese are not going to join this kind of model, that the Russians are not interested to join this kind of model. And even in Europe, you have, I would say, a big, let's say, confrontation between what you might call the German model and what you might call let's say, the rest of Europe, or the Mediterranean, if you want, Club Med model, which is quite different. Because even in Europe, look at one thing. On the one hand, you have the Germans. They have an economy which is based really on exports, which is based on a kind of unrelenting pressure on salaries and wages to, in a way, keep competitiveness. Whereas, for instance, this is not something that is accepted in France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, in other parts of Europe. So we don't think, act, feel, want to live through the same values everywhere in the world.
So just on that subject, can I ask you, do you think that Europe will stay together, given that confrontation between the German model, which obviously happened 70 years ago, once before, and the rest of Europe? Do you think they can stay together?
In a way, we have a paradoxical situation where economic growth in the future will be constrained because nobody can afford to leave the euro. So we are in a situation on the one hand when nobody can afford to leave the euro, because nobody knows what would happen if, say, for instance, Greece were to leave the euro. So Europe cannot abandon the euro because nobody knows what will be the implications. So you don't play lottery with the global economy. But at the same time, they cannot move forward because there are these big differences about how they see society, social models, etc., etc. So they are stuck in the middle. And because they are stuck in the middle, this will limit the ability of Europe to get out of this crisis.
With China, I'm interested that obviously when you mentioned that China obviously is slowing down now, in a way that perhaps was expected, but still it's happening. Do you think that the growth of the emerging markets is finished now for the time being?
Oh, certainly not. Certainly not. I think it is not even short term. It is, I would say, ridiculously myopic to think that the growth of emerging market is now finished, and we can read sometime in the papers at this moment simply because some countries are slowing down or because they are facing some difficulties, some of them coming out of a tapering off of a quantitative easing in the United States. What we see, first of all, is an adjustment, and it will take time, of growth model like in China. But China, while adjusting, will continue to grow at about 7%. People are talking, oh my God, there have been this huge increase of debt and this uncontrolled activity in the non-banking sector. And it is true. It is a problem. It is a risk. But I think it would be very seriously underestimating the ability of a Chinese leadership to deal with this issue. I remember 20 years ago when everybody was saying, oh, the banking system in China is going to collapse because of the size of the non-performing loans. The banking system in China survived quite well. It doesn't function as efficiently as it should, but it has survived. And the government has the ability to gradually correct these imbalances that exist in the system. Second point, very important. We have been saying, okay, but if growth goes below a certain level, then social chaos will erupt because social stability is based on the ability of people to have higher and higher standard of living. That is absolutely true. But at the same time, as we see people picking up in terms of consumption, although consumption has been growing at a slower pace than GDP in China, but as we see that this gap is being filled gradually, very slowly, but it is, we are in this kind of progression. I think China can sustain this adjustment provided that they don't do anything crazy. And I think we should not underestimate the ability of this Chinese leadership to have learned the lesson of the past, to have a huge stake in the stability of a country. And we should not underestimate, I would say, the quality of a number of people who are now in the finance ministry, at the central bank, at the Ministry of Trade, etc., etc. So I would say they have their constraints, they have huge problems, but as much as we should not underestimate the problem, we should not underestimate their ability to deal with them with pragmatism.
I kind of feeling in a lot of the discussions at this conference about Europe, about China, about India, about everything, the elephant in the room is corruption and incompetence to some extent. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the problems in India at the moment are due to corruption and incompetence. That a lot of the difficulties, a lot of the problems in Europe are around corruption in Spain and Italy, and perhaps lower level than in some other countries. Do you think that's correct?
Corruption is part of a problem, but I think it is more complex than that. India has a big problem, but it is not an economic problem. India has a big political problem because the political system in India is so fragmented. It is so motivated by narrow personal interest that in a way you have a rotten political system creating obstacles to doing the kind of reform that the Indian economy needs to really explode the shackles which have been constraining
That's
it.
kind of what I was talking about, I guess, but I suppose it's bringing it in a different way.
So corruption is part of the issue, but it is not the only issue. It is the way the system functions. And in a way, you might say that what we see in India is a kind of perverted form of democracy. And so we see that sometimes we speak about democracy, democracy, democracy. But the quality of democracy is very important. Is it better to have an authoritarian regime knowing what it is doing, or to have a bad quality democracy in terms of the way the system is functioning? I don't know the answer to that. When you look at other countries, of course, corruption is part of a system. But I would say that you can address this issue. And one way to address the issue is being tremendously helped by the rise of civil society, by the internet, by the blog, by everything, because it is exposing corruption.
And social media.
You know, you have seen this episode in China. I don't know if people have been talking about this episode in China, where somebody filmed the wrists of the officials who were attending the National People's Congress. And then they are saying, oh, Mr. So-and-so is having a $10,000 watch at his wrist. How could he pay that watch with his salary? And so on and so forth. So we have this kind of pressure exposing corruption. You have the new middle class in India, in China, getting fed up with this corruption. So I do believe that this is a huge problem. But at the same time, we see that the mindset of people is changing. They are not accepting corruption anymore as a kind of fatality that you need to accept. And they are helped, as I said, by the social media, because it is a tremendous magnifying lens.
We have to leave it there. Thanks very much, Claude.
Thank you.